Okay, so let's start with girls' education and women education. We are like 4 months beyond the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan, and still girls and women, they're deprived from going to schools, universities. So, how much US has to do more to encourage the Taliban to allow women to go back to their education and go back to work?
Well, Zheela, I think this is really one of the most important questions and one of the most important issues because we know that education is a universal right. It really is an entitlement of the women and girls in Afghanistan. They have made incredible progress. And now we're seeing all of these restrictions placed. In many places, obviously, the girls have not gone back to school. The Taliban have put forward a number of reasons, depending on which Talib you're talking to, for why that is the case. In other places, the girls and women in instances that are higher education have been able to continue. There's a program, for example, that the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan has been running in the rural areas, and they've spent years in the rural areas on health and education, and they're able to continue and provide the support to make it possible. So I think one of the keys is obviously persuading all of the Taliban, not some of them in certain places, because it's a very erratic approach and it has to be consistent and it has to be a commitment. Now, one of the ways, obviously, to ensure that that happens is that teachers get paid. We know that teachers are not being paid, and that's another big part of the problem to the extent that they can continue their work. Some of the liberal policies that have been adopted in the last 2 weeks or so by the United States, for example, loosening up some of the restrictions on funding, not going to the Taliban, but funding going directly, for example, to teachers to pay them, funding going to NGOs so that NGOs can provide that assistance. So I think we need a whole lot of things to happen. One, it has to remain a central issue in all discussions with the Taliban. Two, we have to, in the interim, ensure that the resources are there to continue the education. But it has to be absolutely a fundamental consideration of everything going forward, because without education, there is no future. This is critically important to today in Afghanistan and tomorrow in Afghanistan, to the future of Afghanistan.
Sounds good. 1 second, she's a little loud. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The door was open. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Fine. I could hear her. She was very loud because it's very echoing. Never mind. Anyway, so with the new rules with Taliban adding new rules on Afghan women, especially with travel ban, is still hurting women. And economic situation is really dire in Afghanistan. So what should be done to prevent Taliban and really restricting women from doing what they can do?
Well, again, you're so right, Zheela, because we're seeing these restrictions being put on other restrictions that are making the ability to work, the ability to move from place to place, the ability to go to school impossible. And we see demonstrations of women very courageous, very bravely going out and protesting, particularly these restrictions that make their lives so unpalatable, particularly in the context also that they are absolutely essential to the functioning of Afghan society. It's not that this is a marginal issue. This is a central issue. So I think that in conversations with the Taliban, whether it's governments, whether it's the multilateral representatives of the United Nations, for example, these issues have to be central issues in all of the discussions because the inclusion of women, the protection of their human rights, is central. And that is where it needs to be. And this needs to be part of every conversation, and in the possibilities as these conversations take place, that there will be diplomatic breakthroughs to have some positive changes occurring, particularly on lifting these kinds of restrictions and parlaying the leverage that governments and the multilats have, that this be very clear to the Taliban, that this is absolutely central and a non-negotiable element if they want to see progress for them.
But Taliban claim that these rules are Islamic and they want women to follow the Islamic rules. But there are other Islamic countries that women are allowed to work and get education. What has to be done and help these women? Because a lot of women are widows and they're victims of 40 years of war and they're sole breadwinner of a whole family. And if they cannot travel like from North to Kabul to meet a son who's working there, how they can really manage their lives?
Well, you're exactly right. First of all, they are not Islamic. This is a very extreme, radical interpretation on the part of the Taliban as to what is Islamic. And in fact, I've spoken to many scholars, to experts. It's almost it's almost inaccurate to even refer to it as extreme Islam, because many say they don't even recognize this in Islam. So it's the hijacking of Islam, and it's the hijacking of Islam for political purposes. This is how the Taliban see the way that they think women should be treated, and they use religion as the excuse. So they'll say, yes, we believe girls should be educated, can be educated, but within the context of Islam. That is within the context of their own view of how this should be. And as you said so rightly, in the predominantly Muslim world, this does not exist. These kinds of restrictions do not exist. Women and education and Islam are consistent. Women and working and Islam are consistent. It is not the Taliban view, and we have to disabuse them of that in terms of the rationale. And I think to the extent that there is more understanding of what Islam represents and Islam's consistency with the dignity and rights of women, this needs to get across.
So do you think respecting women's rights and changing behavior of what they're doing or dealing the way with Afghan people will probably help them and get recognition by the outside world?
Well, I think initially the whole issue of recognition is one that will be discussed and debated down the line. Right now, all the things we are talking about in terms of inclusion, in terms of education, in terms of human rights, this is not about recognition of the Taliban. It's about negotiating with the Taliban to ensure that this happens, just like funding to deal with the humanitarian crisis, funding to deal with the fact that teachers and healthcare workers haven't been paid. That is not a benefit to the Taliban, it going into the hands of the Taliban. It is a benefit to the people of Afghanistan who are suffering greatly. Now, I know some Taliban are saying there's not even a humanitarian crisis when we know the extent of the crisis. So the question of recognition, this is a long way from recognition. There has got to be massive commitment to operating within the norms of the conventional international way of proceeding. I do think there have to be greater diplomatic efforts made, greater discussions with the Taliban on the part of the broader diplomatic community, the regional governments, others, because there have to be political solutions to a number of these key questions. But also women need to be part of those discussions. And they cannot and should not happen in the absence of the women of Afghanistan. who are half the population of the country, who have demonstrated so significantly their leadership and why their agency is so important. They need to be a critical part of everything going forward.
So you're in touch with some of the women moved to the U.S. recently, and how U.S. and prominent women activists like we here around or other city, they're helping these women, they're receiving them and giving them the support they need.
Well, you know, Zheela, on the one hand, we all are focused on Afghan women. Some of them have been forced now to be evacuated, to leave their country. It is no easy solution, because to be a refugee is not something any of them wanted to be. But they are either here or in Europe or in other places now, trying still to have impact back home. So I think this is really two parts. And the recent appointments by the Biden administration, both of Rina Amiri to deal with the whole issue, to be the envoy of Afghan women and girls and human rights, focused on the kinds of issues we've been talking about within Afghanistan. And then the appointment of Stephanie Foster to the Afghan task force at the State Department. Her responsibilities more go to resettlement. So you've got all the issues within Afghanistan, critical issues, and then you've got issues that the women who've had to be evacuated are confronting, they and their families, getting them jobs so they can have income, ensuring that they are getting what they need in terms of housing and their resettlement, their immigration status. There are a lot of key challenges that have to be addressed. So on the one hand, we're all working to try to do both outside of Afghanistan and inside of Afghanistan. But I think the most important thing I want to convey to your viewers and listeners is that the women of Afghanistan with whom I have spoken, who've been threatened and against their will had to leave, their minds are in Afghanistan. Everything they want to do going forward is to continue their work somehow, obviously not in the country until better days, but outside the country. And one of the things is looking to see how they can use their current situation to continue their work within Afghanistan. Obviously, it will be different, but they want to continue that work.
Sounds great. Just last question. Are you aware of this woman parliamentarian in Greece that they form a woman-only parliament, Afghan woman? Are you aware of that? Are you involved with, are you in touch with these people? And what do you think about them? Can they have a voice in this inclusive government of Taliban?
I think your question, the heart of your question is yes. Many of the parliamentarians who have left the country against because of the reality that they would be endangered, are trying to function in a way outside of Afghanistan now where they can continue to have influence. And I think we all understand Afghan voices, the voices of the women within Afghanistan, the voices of the Afghan women outside of Afghanistan continue to be absolutely essential. We need to be consulting with them in terms of how to go forward, what makes the most sense, getting their advice, but also their consulting and continuing to stay in touch with the women within Afghanistan who do not want to be abandoned. You know, one of the signs I saw in the demonstrations, recent protests, is do not abandon us. So we all have to do what we can to make sure that they are not abandoned, that their voices are heard, that they are critical to addressing the humanitarian crisis, for example, in terms of the planning, where the resources should go, the distribution of the resources. Absolutely essential that we continue to make visible the lives and work and circumstances of Afghan women.
So great to talk to you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Let me stop this. I appreciate it.